Good evening.
Good evening.
I'd like to thank you very much for coming out this evening. My name is Joe Geiger. I'm the Director of Archives and History, and this is a part of our Thursday evening lecture series, and we have a very special event this evening. I just want to note a couple of things that are upcoming. On April the 19th, that will be a Thursday, of course. Nat DeBruin will be here from Marshall University. He's head of the Special Collections Department, and he's going to talk about photograph preservation, and that's actually preserving old photographs. So if you have an interest in that, that will be on April the 19th. On May 17th, we will have Jack Canfield here to speak about the year 1968. Jack was, I believe he was Chief of Staff for Governor Hewlett Smith, and was involved in a lot of things during that very tumultuous year. On May 31st, Anna Evans Gilmer will be here to kick off our block lecture series. That will be on May 31st, Anna Evans Gilmer. But tonight we have a very special guest. Rebecca Park is portraying Jemima Boone Calloway. And one of the first things that she wanted to note is that Jemima Boone Calloway's story can be found in documents and materials here in the state archives. And so she wanted us to share some of that. So what I am noting is that in the census section, right back here behind me, in the census section of the archives, from the first census of Kentucky in 1790, on page 112, Fayette County, there is a Flanders Calloway with a 1 after that name, and that number indicates the number of slaves that he owned at that time.
In the genealogy section, which is through here and around the corner, from the Boone family, a genealogical history of the descendants of George and Mary Boone who came to America in 1770. On page 119, sixth generation, Jemima Boone, born 4 October 1762 in North Carolina, married about 1782, Flanders Calloway, born in Virginia 1758, died 1824, son of James Calloway, died 1829 in Montgomery County, Missouri.
In the biographical section of the archives from my father, Daniel Boone, the 1851 interviews by Lyman Draper of Nathan Boone and his wife Olive, on page 47, Lyman Draper. Can you tell me about the capture of the girls at Boonesborough in 1776? Nathan Boone. The girls went pleasuring in a canoe on Sunday. One of the Calloway girls wanted to go to a certain point to get some young cane, and my sister, Jemima Boone, was steering the canoe. As the canoe touched the shore, Indians leaped out and seized the girls. Jemima Boone was born October 4th, 1762, and was in her 13th year when she was captured. It was not long after that she married young to Flanders Calloway.
This is in the rare book collection of the archives from a volume in a series entitled Library for My Young Countrymen, dated 1843. On page 154, the appendix, The Adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone, formerly a hunter, containing a narrative of the wars of Kentucky. This is given by himself. On the 14th day of July, 1776, 2 of Colonel Calloway's daughters and 1 of mine were taken prisoner near the fort. I immediately pursued the Indians with only 8 men, and on the 16th overtook them, killed 2 of the party, and recovered the girls.
In the land grants section of the archives, from the Kentucky Land Grants by Gilson, Chapter 2, Virginia Grants, 1782-1792, page 35. Grantee Calloway, Flanders. Acres 900, Book 1, page 437. Date survey, February 14th, 1783. County, Fayette. Watercourse, Hickman's Creek.
Again, continued from my father, Daniel Boone, from the 1851 interviews by Lyman Draper of Nathan Boone and his wife Olive Van Bibber Boone. Page 97. Nathan Boone, sometime in 1793 I went to Kentucky. There I stayed with Flanders Calloway and sometimes with William Hayes in Fayette County. Calloway resided on a branch of Hickman's Creek about 6 miles from Boone Station. I attended school there, kept by Reverend John Rice, a Baptist clergyman. The school was about halfway between the residences of the Callaways and the Hayeses, who lived about 2 miles apart. On page 104, Nathan Boone. By the spring of 1799, we were preparing to move to Missouri.
Yes, the moon she will be bleeding. Oh, sister, are you ready? For the time is drawing near. I'm glad to be with you today to speak a few words of my father, Daniel Boone. My name is Jemima Boone Calloway, and my earliest recollections of my daddy would be when I was 2 or 3 years old. It was Christmas Day. And don't you know, a man burst through the door of our cabin, and I would have been scared to death, except my brothers and my sister were just squealing with happiness. "Daddy, Daddy," they said. For Daddy had been gone these many months to Florida. His own daddy had died, and he and his brother and a couple other fellas had gone down to spy out the land in Florida to see what they thought of it. "Oh, Mother," he said, "we will move to Florida. I have purchased land near what you call Pensacola." And then he went on as he sat there at the table eating that good food that Mother had been cooking for Christmas. "Oh," he said, "I told you I'd be home by Christmas, and here I am." Then he told her about the land in Florida. Somewhat marshy, somewhat hard to find your way in. He told her about the game there, somewhat sparse, and the skins somewhat thin. It takes a good cold winter to make a thick fur on an animal, don't you know? So Mother took it all in, and she put her foot down and said we would not move to Florida. Whether it was because the land was swampy, or because the game was sparse, or the furs were bad, or because Mother did not want to live so far away from her own parents, her sisters, her cousins, her in-laws, and all the little children that were being born to the Bryans and the Boones. We did not go to Florida. As you probably know, very soon after, Daddy, which is what I call him, was dead set on going to Kentucky. I was 10 years old, and Judge Henderson put together the money to finance us going over to Kentucky. And I was with Mother and Daddy and my sisters and brothers, and you can imagine there were more of us by that time. And we were in the lead party. And my own oldest brother, James, he was 16. He'd started to sound a bit like Daddy himself in his voice and all. He and young Henry Russell were to bring up the livestock, and they hadn't quite joined up with us. And There were some men in the back as well. I believe Captain Russell was behind. And so the three different parties of us were kind of strewed out there on the trail as we were going to the Cumberland Gap. We made camp for the first night that we were all on the trail. I don't like to remember the next morning. The sounds of the cries in the camp, the hushed voices so the children wouldn't hear. What had happened was there was a man in our camp that wasn't happy with the plan, and he had turned back. And he had come upon the camp with James and young Henry Russell and found them murdered and mutilated. Mommy gave Daddy a couple of winding sheets out of her packs to wrap the boys in so that their skin would be kept from the cold earth. And we were all so disheartened that we turned back for a time on the Clinch and then back at the Yadkin, back in North Carolina, back with the Bryans and all the Boones. But Daddy still wanted to go to Kentucky. He stayed busy too. He and Deutschman Michael Stoner were enlisted to go into Kentucky when there was such a danger. They were to retrieve 3 parties of surveyors and bring them out alive, and that they did. They all came back with the hair on their heads. Can you imagine how I felt knowing my daddy had gone back into that dark land, and how I felt when he came home again? Wasn't too long after, Henderson put together this party. The men went forward. My sister Susie was old enough. She went as cook along with another slave woman, cooking for what, 30 men or so out on the trail. Can you imagine? They were to hike a trail over to the Cumberland Gap. And that they did. And came down into Kentucky, spied a piece of land, and the men decided to call it Boonesborough. They thought that sounded quite civilized instead of Boone's Fort or Boone's Station. Boonesborough. As soon as he could, Daddy came back for us. I'll never forget my first sight of Boonesborough. It did not look civilized to me. It was a cabin here and there, and a bit of a palisade wall, nowhere near as finished. You know, the big logs put down in a trench with the pointy tops and the spaces in between filled with what all. You see, every man there was interested in staking his own claim and putting in a crop of his own. And it took quite a leader among men to bring them all together to work on the palisade and make it safe. That was 75. It was the summer of 1776. And no, we had not heard of that Declaration of Independence, and yet it was July 14th. Now, how many of you have heard of what happened to me on July 14th? Myself, and Betsy, and Fanny Calloway. It was a Sunday. It was rather warm, as you can imagine, in July, and I had hurt my foot. I had stepped on the stub of a cane, and I told the girls if I could just go to the river and dangle my foot over the canoe, the one canoe that we had in the whole of the settlement, then it would feel so much better. Oh, they said, your daddy told you not to go to the other side of the river. And I said, I'm not afraid of that. They said, are you more afraid of your daddy or those Injuns that might be over there? And we just went on until suddenly we realized we were very close to the other side of the Kentucky River. And then an Injun came out into the water and grabbed the painter on the end of the canoe and pulled the canoe over to the side. And there was another, and there was another. Oh, I let out a scream, bloody murder. I was sure if my daddy could hear, he would come. But then the Injun showed us that if we made noise, that would be the end of us. And we knew the stories. We knew what had happened to other captives that fought the Indians. And so we made light of the matter. And we went on with them. Oh, my foot hurt so bad I just couldn't go very fast, don't you know? And we would break a twig there and a limb there. The Indians decided we were going too slow for fancy Sunday clothes, and they ripped off our dresses up to about our knees, and any little threads or pieces of cloth that we could leave behind we knew might help us in a rescue. We were very hopeful that first day. We were very hopeful the second day. Even though it was dampening our spirits to have a cold camp at night with no fire at all. That third day, the Indians killed a young buffalo and took some of the meat of the hump of the buffalo where the best cuts of the meat are. And they decided we would have a fire. We made camp. We were so dejected. The three of us just sat down under a tree. And then one of the Indians that was supposed to be keeping guard, he came forward to the fire to light his pipe. Not much of a guard, don't you know? And he began to look back into the woods in a funny kind of way. And then he went back to lighting his pipe. But I followed his line of gaze, and I saw my daddy. And he was creeping up, just as low as he could. His eyes met mine, and he gave me a sign. Oh, I wanted to scream and yell. I didn't even let the girls know what I saw. Slowly and slowly he came toward us. If he made the wrong move, if there was some loud noise, those Indians could take our necks and our scalps right there. And then suddenly there was a gunshot, but before I even heard the gunshot, I remember that man standing there at the fire and the blood just splurting out of him, and over he went in the fire. He got up later and ran away. And then it all broke loose. Gunfire and whooping and hollering, and the Indians just took off as fast as they could. And in came my daddy and another man, and he saw Betsy with her hair down loose and thought she was one of the savages and almost bashed her brains out. And when someone cried out and he stopped, he burst into tears thinking what he could have done, what he almost did. And then my daddy said, "Let's all sit down and have a good cry." And he did cry as he was wont to do when need be. Oh, and going back to see my mother, she laughed and she cried at the same time, which was her habit when need be. We kept watch. Every man that went out to do any work in the field, he had someone to watch for him. It was the winter of '77 that was so hard and so terrible across the frontier. And it was January of '78 when we ran completely out of salt. No salt. And yet there was a salt lick not 20 miles away. And so all of our men, say 10, packed up the big kettles and went to the Licking River, to the Blue Licks, and they began to make salt. And they brought some back to us, and they kept making salt. Now my Flanders was with them, you see. Maybe I should have mentioned that Flanders was one that helped rescue me. And Betsy was within weeks married to Sam Henderson, one of her rescuers. And Fanny was soon married to the boy that she was sweet on. And Flanders and I, at that time, then began to make our home. From these salt makers came Flanders and Mr. Brooks. They had been tasked with bringing in the meat to the salt makers along with my father, Daniel Boone. In they came, and they said a strange thing had happened. The salt makers were gone, and as far as they could tell, they were taken by a large band of Shawnees north of the Ohio. Now, what can you imagine would happen to these men if they were taken north of the Ohio? And so there were many long months where we did not know what their fate had been. You remember I told you that the palisade had not yet been completed, that the fort was in something of a disarray and very undermanned. Richard Calloway, who was Flanders' uncle, I'm sure you know, was there in charge, but he could not muster the men to complete this palisade. And so it will be of no surprise to any of you to know that Mother took my brothers and sisters and even Susanna, my older sister, and her husband, Will Hayes, and they went back to the Yadkin Valley. With the uncertainty of these men across the Ohio, who could blame her to want to be in safety? It must have been June. One day I was going about my business, I heard some hooping and hollering. Boone, they said, Boone. I couldn't believe my ears. And I ran to the cabin where Mother and Daddy had lived. And I burst in, the door was open, I should say, and there was my daddy sitting in a chair with the cat in his lap. And what a look on his face. Here he had thought that he had escaped his Shawnee captors to come home to my mother. And no one was there but the cat and myself. Daddy began to tell his tale of being captured. He had first been taken in the woods. He knew that the salt makers stood not a chance of this very large company of Shawnee. He told the Shawnee that he was sure those salt makers would just soon be British as American. Why don't they just come down and talk these men into going home with them, he said. And so he did. And by doing that, do you remember what I said about the state of affairs at Boonesborough? Our palisade was not even completed. We had 10 men with all the women and children. And the Shawnee were diverted from coming straight to Boonesborough, and instead they turned with these men who were well able to make the trip back to Chillicothe. Chillicothe. How do you say it? Chillicothe? Chillicothe? Chillicothe. So by doing that, he had saved our skins. Do you know they took him all the way to Detroit, where the hair buyer was? Do you know? Have you heard of Governor Hamilton, the hair buyer? And he parleyed with him. Oh yes, the people at Boonesborough would gladly become British again. They'll have nothing to do with the revolution, I'm sure. We've asked for powder and provisions from Virginia, and they have not sent it, so I'm sure they would be happy to surrender Boonesborough to the crown. And in so talking, he made friends of all the Indians and all the British, and he came back to Chillicothe and listened some more until he knew that the Indians were swarming and they were going to attack at Boonesborough. He managed to slip away, and he ran back for days. Had one meal in all those days running back, more than 100 miles, till he burst in to find the cat, as I have told you. Well, there were some who could not believe that this man was now being honest with us. And they were afraid that they were going to be turned over to the British. They could not understand that my father had saved the lives of those at Boonesborough. And as the men trickled in from escaping from the Shawnees, some testified that my father was treasonous, and some testified that my father was a hero. But there was no time to debate this. My father led the men to build the palisade into completion, to start to dig a well on the interior of Boonesborough. And sure enough, one day we saw those Shawnees file into the meadow right outside of our walls. Oh, they parleyed back and forth. Boone, they said, Boone, your father, Chief Blackfish, he is sorrowful. He wants to know why you left him. Boone said, I wanted to see my woman and my children. And they parleyed back and forth. Sometimes our men would go out and actually meet with the savages, until there was a moment when they decided they would all shake hands. Well, there was one white man for every 2 of the red men. And as they came to shake hands with the white man, somebody's gun went off from the fort. My father had told them to be ready. And somehow all of our men escaped back to Boonesborough. Some were badly injured, but they got free somehow out of surprise, we must think. And the siege began, the siege of Boonesborough. It went on for some 10 days. They tried to build a tunnel from the river that would go under our fort. They mocked back and forth. Oh, the profanity. The black man, Pompey, that was the translator, he mocked and taunted from the tree and showed his backside until someone got a good shot in. And then the men called from Boonesborough, "Where is Pompey?" And the Indians said, "He is sleeping," until finally they admitted, "He is dead." Oh, the bullets, the lead, the arrows, the flint. Livestock would be killed from bullets coming into the fort, and we would slaughter them for meat to feed ourselves. 10 days of living in our filth in close quarters. I myself took a bullet. It was what we call a spent bullet, without much energy, having probably bounced off several items on its way to me. It lodged in the fleshy part of my lower back. And we were able to dislodge it simply by pulling my dress, and out it popped. So I was not much wounded, but as this was part of the struggle in the Revolution, you could say that you are now looking at a wounded war veteran, could you not? One morning the Indians were gone. They had melted away into the night. They had taken their dead from the battlefield. They had left the body of Pompey. Life turned somewhat normal, always with our guard on, but we began to put in crops and build homes there at Boonesborough. My father wanted only to go get my mother from the Yadkin Valley, but first he had to stand trial. And the short of it is, he was not only exonerated, he was elevated to the rank of major, which put him above Colonel Calloway, his accuser. The next day we left to go back and get Mother. It took some time to convince her to come. She had to be ready. And then she came back. 20 years Flanders and I lived there on Hickman's Creek. And then my brother, Daniel Morgan Boone, went to first the Mississippi area, and then he went to Missouri. My father had said, "Oh, if you get to the Spanish territory, be sure that you talk to the governor and ask him if he would want us to come and settle there." Now, who wouldn't want a man like Daniel Boone to come and settle when you know that he will bring with him some of the finest settlers to claim the land and tame it? And so in 1799, we loaded up an immense, huge canoe, some taking the livestock by land, and we women in the boat. Nathan, don't you know, made it as far as Limestone, which is what you call Maysville, got his marriage license and went back to where Olive Van Bibber lived, right across there from Point Pleasant, made her his wife, and they journeyed together out to meet us in Missouri. We've been 20 years there, where I live in a fine stone house. Mother passed away the 12th year of the new century. Susanna is gone, as are my other sisters, Rebecca, Lavina. My own son, Captain James Calloway, was killed in military action in 1815. And now Daddy has passed from this world. I will say of my father, for one who lived 20 years here and then 20 years there in a stone house, I can only say that I stand on the shoulders of men like Daniel Boone. And for that I am so grateful. Oh, brother, to be ready. Oh, sister, to be ready. Oh, father, are you ready? For we now must bid adieu. I get so emotional when I think about Jemima and how much she loved her father. They were really, really special to each other, even though he had so many other children. Typically in a Chautauqua type presentation where we do portrayals, we take questions in character and then we take questions out of character. And I'd be happy if anybody has questions for me, Becky Park. But I also was curious if anybody else had had interesting experiences where they have dug into the books and the different bits of information and tried to imagine who this person was that they were tracking down in history and what their feelings were. I know that Jemima Boone and her husband founded a church called the Friendship Baptist Church in Missouri, and it dissolved soon after her own death. So I can only imagine it was a small church that she was a leader in and was really important to her. And being a Baptist church, I thought was interesting since her parents were raised Quaker, although they didn't practice that much of the religion. They were very Quaker-minded, being accepting of all human beings as the children of God. And so that's one thing I've always wondered is, like what her religious thoughts were, but it's just not there. I haven't found it, so that's kind of the struggle that we have when we look in the archives and we can see dates and pieces of land and names, but how do we really know what they thought and what they felt? Unless the person puts it on paper themselves, it's sometimes lost forever. But it's good fodder for the imagination, isn't it? Yes?
Are you a descendant of the Boone line?
No, not that I know of. Yes, Freddie.
What was Daniel Boone on trial for?
He really had acted a friend to the Indians and a friend to the British. He even carried his commission papers from Lord Dunmore. Looking back on it, we think like, oh yeah, we're all Americans and the British were the enemies. But they were British when she was a little girl, and he was British when he was a man. And so it's all very confusing, but he had acted so friendly with them that Colonel Calloway had taken great offense. The Calloways for generations after would say bad things about the Boones and would admit that they hated Indians. So it was a matter of, some people have thought that he was paranoid because again and again he fought over the least little decisions in leadership with Boone. But again and again, he provided the kind of leadership that the people needed. And so he was exonerated, as I said. So there are 4 counts of treason that were in the papers that survived, but there's not a real detailed account of his trial. However, how many of you know the works of Alan Eckert? He's written The Long Knives, Randy, The Frontiersman.
Ton of books.
Yeah, and it's historical fiction because he writes it like a novel, but they're very well researched. And one of his last books was The Court Martial of Daniel Boone, and it's really an excellent account, very plausible. But So that explains a lot more than you actually find in the archives. Yes.
What was the relationship of Colonel Calloway and Jemima's husband?
Well, the Callaways were really interesting people. Do you know the area of Bedford, Virginia? Near the Otters of the Twin Peaks of the Otter or something like that?
Peaks of Otter.
Peaks of Otter, thank you. So the Richard Calloway's generation suffered the loss of their parents from an Indian attack. You know, I'm wondering now if it was disease or Indian attack, but they were orphaned as young boys, you know, not quite grown, and raised themselves. And so Richard's brother was, I think, I better not say it, I can't remember Flanders' father's name, but so Richard was the uncle of Flanders Calloway, and apparently they were just two very different people. You know, that's one assumption you can't make when you're thinking about families, is that, oh, they were in the same family, they thought the same way. Think about your own families. A lot of different personalities living under the same roof, right? So they were uncle and nephew and very different people. Richard Calloway only lived another 18 months after the trial. He was killed by Indians when he was working in the fields with his slaves.
I was trying to decide how Jemima would have handled the relationship between the animosity between her father and the colonel.
Exactly.
That would be difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, if you've ever had to live close with somebody that
Was he
just
living
rubbed
in-
you the wrong way.
Was he living in Kentucky or Missouri when he was tried?
It was right at Boonesborough. It was
Boonesborough.
right after the siege. As soon as the Indians were gone, they brought him to trial, and as soon as the trial was over, he went back to North Carolina to bring his family back to Kentucky.
How many children did Jemima have?
8, 9, 10. Yeah, at least 8, and then, you know, you read another list and it's got another person in there. And I've never seen a list that included Flanders Jr., and yet when you read some stories, it'll say Flanders Jr., the son of Flanders, did this and that, so 8, 9, or 10. Jeff?
Did you live in the Kanawha Valley?
Jemima never did. You remember the reading that said that Nathan went to Kentucky. And the reason it said he went to Kentucky was that was when his mother and father lived at Point Pleasant. I love that part of the story, but it's not really part of Jemima's story. And that is, they moved, when they went back, after the trial, he went and got his wife and his family and came back to Boonesborough just long enough for him to build elsewhere, as you can imagine. Such hard feelings. And it's called Boone Station. And then they started having lawsuits over the surveys he had done. You've heard of shingling, where, you know, one claims this much and the other claims that much, and it's a real mess in court. Daniel was a pretty good surveyor, but he didn't follow up and do the paperwork. And so he ran into trouble again and again until men were cursing him in court and calling him names and defaming him. And so he moved to what is now Maysville. It's called Limestone. That was the first stop after, if you're coming down the river, you come to Point Pleasant, and then there was nothing of civilization until you got to Maysville or Limestone. So he had sort of a tavern there. Rebecca cooked. They had orphans from one of their family members that had died. And they, you know, kept store and would have people pass through and stay with them. They even kept captives, Indian captives, and were paid by the government. Very enterprising people, very hardworking. But he decided he wanted to move to the wilderness, so he moved to West Virginia. They moved to Point Pleasant, kept store again, and that's when he served in the legislature in Virginia. And from there, they sent Nathan to live with Jemima and one of her other sisters. I think it was Lavina. It's kind of hard to decipher when you're reading the archives. And went to school, so he was pretty well educated. And I think Jemima picked up some education there too, living so close to this Baptist minister. And so then the Boones came to Brushy Fork of Sandy River. They had a bear hunting winter where they killed more than 100 bears. This is Rebecca and Daniel, and they were like 60 years old. And they rendered the fat and put it in barrels and sold it. It was very valuable, and the skins and the meat and all was fairly valuable, but the rendered fat was, it was fuel. You could make lamps out of it and stuff like that. So they did things like that. They loved making maple sugar together. They loved doing salt, but they did a lot of maple sugar. And so from there, they got the idea to move to Missouri, which put them in Spanish territory, which became French territory, which became part of the United States of America. And through it all, Boone pretty much lost all of his claim to any major piece of land. But he was so well taken care of, and he was so well respected, and he'd still go on long hunts until he absolutely could not. And so, all told, I think he had a wonderful retirement. You've been awfully good to listen to. What time is it? Is it 6:45?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just wonder, what drew you to Jemima Boone?
Well, if you know Doug Wood and his wife, they make these fantastic events happen, and they needed somebody to tell the story of first Mary Ingalls, and I did the story from the perspective of her daughter, Rhoda. And then they said, well, how about Rebecca Boone, Daniel Boone's wife? And I did that once or twice. But then they said, well, his daughter was actually captured. So when we do our Mary Ingalls, Indian captive kind of story, why don't you do the Jemima Boone Indian captive story? And that's when I fell in love with her. I think she was really spunky, married at 13 or 14, stayed in the wilderness when her mother went home, just really interesting person. And there was one incident when they were coming back. He'd come over to North Carolina to get them after the trial and everything. And you'll just find this one little anecdote that says, the river was swollen and nobody would cross, and Jemima put this other girl on a horse and jumped in the river, and they almost made it over. And the horse went under and they fell off the horse, and she came up laughing, and she said, well, that's better than being taken captive by the Indians. And when you look at the dates, I think she was carrying her first child. So, yeah, what's not to love about a woman like that? So.
Where is this land located that I don't remember what you called it, but you said the mother went back and stayed there.
The Yadkin Valley?
Yeah, where is that?
Yeah, that's in North Carolina.
Okay.
And, there's some names on, it's Boone. Boone, North Carolina is in the area. It's hard to pin down where they were because they moved around a lot. But the Boones and the Bruns came down. The Boones came from Exeter, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. And the Bryans came from near Winchester, Frederick County, Virginia. And, they all kind of settled there together. So it's really not even 7 o'clock? Okay, good, because I wanted to tell you this whole story. I threatened Joe about doing this presentation about, where'd Joe go?
I hear his voice. Hey, Joe. His name has been mentioned.
She was asking me about the Yadkin Valley, and that would be where Daniel and Rebecca Boone met and fell in love. And if you're trying to figure out somebody that's in the archives, please keep in mind what your life was like when you were 10 years old or 2 years old or 15 years old. And you start thinking about that fella that I keep seeing. Isn't he an interesting person? And so I told Joe I was going to do a presentation called Sex in the Archives. Because I kept reading that Jemima stayed at Boonesborough to wait for her daddy to come out of captivity. And then I was reading something else, and I thought, wait a minute, she got married to Flanders like within the year. She stayed at Boonesborough because that's where her life was. That's where her love was. That's where she wanted to be. And there was a moment in the story of Daniel and Rebecca that I had read as a girl. Maybe you've read it. He came in with a reputation, you know. He'd been in Braddock's defeat and gotten away from that. He was known as a real good shot. So here she is, part of the Bryan family, and they're a great family. Her mother was French extraction, and her father was a weaver, so she knew all about fine fabrics. And it was the spring of the year, and he was 20, and she was 15, and they were both very handsome people, okay? And the cherry trees are in bloom. So the young people have a day off, and they all go out into this cherry grove. And so Rebecca and Daniel end up by themselves, okay? So I'd read this as a little girl. Then David cut her apron with a knife. And when they got back to the other people and they noticed that her very fine cambric apron was damaged, and they said, what happened? And they found out that he had cut it with his knife, and he said, I was testing her to see what kind of wife she could be. And in my little girl's book, it came across like he tested her temper. He took his knife and he cut her apron to see if she would get angry or not. What if you were 15 and you were with a man that was amazing and he was 20 and you were alone sitting under a tree? He probably didn't even take that knife out of the scabbard. They were probably so close that he damaged her apron with this knife that was beside it. Need I go on? Need I become any more descriptive? Well, the wonderful thing is now when you read a book and you're interested in something in the book, you can usually just find the author and email them. So I emailed, who wrote Daniel Boone? Famous novelist. And for some reason I can't think of his name, but he wrote Cold Creek, Cold Mountain. Robert, oh, he's so famous, and I'm just not thinking of his name. Michael, you brought me his book twice. What was the author's name?
Come on, Michael.
So I emailed him and I said, you know, first I said something about the book, blah, 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 and then I thought, I'm going to ask him about this, and I asked him, and he goes, oh, that's interesting. And that's all he said, and I was like, I'm not going to go any further. I embarrassed myself. But I've really been able to, you know, read more into it. If you just remember how people change as they go from being children to being adults. Their motivations, you know, the alliances, their tempers, you know, what they choose to do. There, Joe, I did it. Another moment was right before Daniel's father, Squire Boone, died. The authors, the writers will speculate, why wasn't Rebecca having any babies? Was she mad at him? They always think, oh, she must have been mad at him if they're not having babies constantly. And, you know, it occurs to me that when your father's dying, you go and you're with them, right? You're with your mother and your father a lot. You know, so little things like that. Will I ever know? I might be digging in a book someday and I'll just get another little clue and I'll be able to confirm these ideas. What about you all? Have you found things in the archives?
I could spend years in here. It's just so fascinating. I was back in microfilm, you know, the newspapers from 100 years ago, and it's just fascinating how the newspaper has evolved into what it is today and what it was then. But I like the presentation of each section, and I'd like a big sign for each section so I could, you know, be more comfortable, you know, searching and researching. But this is an amazing place, and I think it's one of those gems in West Virginia that needs, you know, more people need to take advantage of. It's just so fascinating.
One thing I think, the books themselves are marvelous, but what are in the people who work here? What is in their heads? They know which book, they know where to send you. Make use of these people. They're very, very talented.
Brady?
Did Daniel Boone have money or property or land or anything when he was older?
He didn't, and I think it was frustrating for him that people around him accumulated wealth, and he did not. You know, he certainly worked hard, but I think he cared about being in the wilderness a lot more than he did accumulating a lot of wealth, and he just wasn't very good at it. He, like I said, he didn't follow through on paperwork, and so things slipped through his fingers. But some people think it was a real crime, the way Kentucky treated him and the way the United States government treated him about his claims in Missouri. That yes, technically maybe the paperwork wasn't done correctly, but how could you want to shortchange a man like that? When he did get money, some people say that he went back to Kentucky and paid his debts, which he probably didn't need to do, right? Who was going to come press their claims out in Missouri? But he was very conscientious, and instead of keeping the money himself, he paid his debts. So some of us think that that's where the riches lies in our character, and he certainly left the stories behind, and I think that's probably what he cared most about. The Indians called him Wide Mouth. See, some of you have wide mouths right now. And so that's also a secret, I think, of how he lived so long, because the men that fought back and were angry and were racist and hated the Indians, they were the ones that were killed and scalped. But so many times the Indians came upon him when he was on a hunting trip, and they would take everything he had, but he would laugh with them and share his flask with them, and so his character saved his life again and again. And to me, that's his riches.
I think in temperament, he probably tended more towards the Indian, towards a native outlook on life than the traditional British. He was a free thinker, and you know, he loved the land and nature and everything more than the typical person there did.
Right. I'm sorry that Chad and his daughter slipped out, because Chad loves, he was sitting right back here, and he loves nature and is a defender of our waters and our trees and our ridge tops. And, you know, his interest in the Indian ways was just so genuine, because that was his life too. You know, he was interested in how they did things because he lived in that kind of world himself. It's almost hard to understand why other people weren't that way. But they went in with the idea, I think it has to do with racism, and it has to do with thinking that you're above nature and people that live close to nature.
Would any of that come from his Quaker background?
I always thought it did. His father didn't get along with the Quaker groups because I know he got in trouble in Exeter because one of Daniel's brothers had married outside of, what do they call it, a worldly person or something like that, outside of the Quaker circle. And then it started to happen again another time, and he just couldn't stand for it being judged like that. But as far as being a Quaker and not being racist and accepting
He still had the mindset.
people as children of God, they're all children of God, I think that is part of him getting along with the Native Americans.
Did I hear you say that he had that Jemima and a slave had gone to cook or something?
Susanna, uh-huh.
Susanna, okay. It surprises me that he had slaves.
Mm-hmm.
That really surprises me. It just, I wonder how he justified that.
Well, it is hard for us to put ourselves back in that time and understand that. I know I love the TV series Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr. But he is very much speaking from this time, you know, how outrageous it was that one person would own another person.
But with his Quaker background, that surprises me.
Well, that's a good point. Andy?
I think also consider that with Native Americans, the worst thing a person could do was show fear. And Boone didn't do that. You know, I'm sure he went through the gauntlet and he didn't show fear. If a person in their culture, a person that would show fear, that was like the worst thing you could do. And that's, I think, where the nickname Indian Brave, part of that originated. So I would say that was, you know, one of the things that helped him survive. He wasn't afraid of them.
Right.
Or if he was, he didn't show fear.
Well, just for instance, when he was taken at the salt licks before he surrendered the salt makers, he had just put this meat on his pack horse when he realized he was being followed. And so he tried to release the meat so he could jump on the horse. And he couldn't even pull his bloody, greasy knife out of the scabbard to do that. And so he ran with his gun and then realized he couldn't do any good against these Indians. He propped his rifle against the tree and he stood behind the tree and waited for the Indians to come. And that was a sign, you know, I'm not going to shoot anybody because there's my gun right there. And he just waited for them and, you know, just started to talk with them and started the wheels turning on how he was going to save the lives not only of the salt makers but everybody in Boonesborough. He was very cool-headed.
Fluent was he in the native languages?
What?
How fluent was he in the native languages?
Well, at first he wasn't very fluent at all, but during captivity he picked up a lot of Shawnee. I mean, other than, you know, just a few words here and there. I know he was present at the Watauga settlement when they, when Judge Henderson bought the Kentucky land from the Cherokees, so, you know, he would have picked up a lot of Cherokee there, but he wasn't fluent until he'd been adopted into the Shawnee family. Anything else? Go ahead.
Did you say he had a child killed by the Indians?
Yes, actually, Daniel Boone, he lost his two oldest boys. And so he was really heartbroken, of course, over James that was lost on their first attempt to move to Kentucky. But then after they had lived in Kentucky and his second son, Israel, was married and a father, Israel had been sick, and this is the last battle of the Revolution, and there was trouble brewing, and so Daniel came and told his son, you know, come on, fight with us. And his son knew he wasn't full strength, and Daniel shamed him into coming with him. And then once the men were together, this was back at the Blue Licks actually, there was a terrible skirmish, and Israel was holding the reins of the horses, and Daniel said, go across the river, and he said, I'll stay with you, Father. And those were his last words. And he was shot and killed. And, you know, Daniel realized that he had made him come. And then also the other settlers were just so hot-headed that Daniel knew it was suicidal for them to engage the British and the Indians because they had such an advantageous placement. And the other men had goaded and said, well, I'll show you who's a coward, you know, and things like that. And so Daniel was just so sorrowful over the loss of his second son. And then it was Susanna, and she was supposed to be quite the wild woman. You know, she lived camped with the men as a young girl. Her husband was fairly erudite. Does that mean you're book learned? And just checking. And but he would drink and had a terrible temper, and he was Will Hayes, and then it was Jemima, and I think she picked the right man to make her life with, and then Rebecca and Lavina and the boys then Jesse, Brian, and Nathan, Daniel Morgan Boone, and Nathan was the youngest. They also lost a child, William. He was born right before Daniel went back to get his wife, and that's another reason she was hesitant to come, is because she had a terribly difficult childbirth and lost the child and needed to rest. So she rested 3 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yes. Was he a large man, Daniel Boone?
I think he was not quite 6 feet. Is that right? Who knows? Come on, we've got some experts in here.
No. No.
He was broad-shouldered and well-built, not excessively large by any means, that had the kind of bearing that made him seem larger than life.
And a 6-foot man at that time was a tall man. The average height was a lot less then.
When he came back from captivity, he had plucked all of his hair except for that top knot. So just imagine you're one of those people that hates the sight of an Indian. Or maybe you're just scared to death of the sight of an Indian. And then you have to abide this man that looks just like one of them, lived with them, was adopted with a family, seemed happy about it, was rumored was going to give you up to them. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much for your very kind attention.